Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes. We are the official podcast of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, and I'm your host, Laura Laurent. This week, we are speaking with Michael McConnell, who is professor and director of the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School. From 2002 to 2009, he served as a circuit judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. He was nominated by President Bush, a Republican, and confirmed by a Democratic Senate by unanimous consent. McConnell has also argued 16 cases in the United States Supreme Court. He's also author of The President Who Would Not Be King, Executive Power Under the Constitution, which will be the basis of our conversation today. The book was published in 2020, but regardless, these topics are timeless. For this conversation, we review some of the safeguards initially set in place for executive power and the conversations founders had about executive power when framing the Constitution and how that can relate to the power that we're seeing leveraged today in the executive office. We discuss some of the history of how we got to our current state of unfettered executive power as a way of thinking about what can be done in the future. All right. Well, Professor McConnell, welcome to Madison's Notes. It's exciting to have you on the show today.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Well, so we're here today to discuss your semi-recent, though like 2020 feels closer than it maybe is in number, but your book, The President Who Would Not Be King, and also more broadly, the executive branch and executive power. So just to kick us off, I want to give us some context around the way executive power has been thought of in American politics. And you propose a framework for understanding executive power that builds on, but also challenges one of the traditional structures of thinking about executive power, which is Justice Robert Jackson's famous concurrence in the Youngstown case. And so for us, just to start out with, can you maybe give us a brief overview of the three-tiered approach that initially was used to evaluate presidential authority, and then follow it up with why you see that as insufficient in today's landscape?
Justice Jackson wrote a concurrence in Youngstown Sheet and Tube against Sawyer, often called the steel seizure case. This was the case where President Harry Truman ordered the temporary seizure of steel mills in the United States in order to end a labor strike, actually in favor on terms favorable to the workers, but in order to avoid a stoppage in steel production right at the height of the Korean War. So there were major sort of military, national security reasons behind this, but alas, he did not have any statutory or constitutional authority for doing that, and the Supreme Court held that this was an unconstitutional act. Justice Jackson, who is a particularly distinguished justice and an exceptionally good writer, wrote a concurring opinion which has gone down in legal history as more important than the majority opinion. And the way he looked at these matters is to say that when there's a conflict between presidential action and a congressional action, or maybe more precisely to say when there is a challenge to possibly unconstitutional or ultra-vires presidential action, cases fall into three categories. Where the president is acting in accordance with the express or implied will of Congress, that's the first category. And in that category, basically, almost anything the president does is going to be okay. If Congress goes along with it, that is all that is necessary. The third category is where the president is actually going against an express action by Congress, for example, violating a statute that Congress may have passed. And in that case, this is what he calls the most severe tests, and the presidential action will not be upheld unless he can point to extremely clear authorization in the Constitution itself. And then the second category, which I leave to the last because it's the least well defined, he actually calls it a zone of twilight, which my students often start singing the song at this point from the Rod Serling TV series. And this is where the president acts, but Congress is neither authorized nor acted against the presidential action. So he's acting in the presence of silence on the part of Congress. And unlike the other two categories where there's a pretty clear answer to almost every question, here there's no clear answer to any. And all Justice Jackson can really say is that the courts have to consider, the contemporary imponderables and the necessities of circumstances of events. I think that this is actually a largely useless and misleading three-part way of thinking about it, but the U.S. Supreme Court has embraced it on 4 or 5 different occasions, and so it is the official test that the U.S. Supreme Court uses.
And I'm curious, when we see that play out, when we say the Supreme Court uses this to assess, they're assessing whether or not the presidential actions are constitutional, is just whether or not it falls in accordance with the, approve, deny, or silence.
That's right. Of course, in truth, the court doesn't follow this test. They say they're following the test, but for example, there's only been one clear example of where a president did something in the face of an unambiguous congressional action to the contrary, and that's a case called Zivotofsky. Congress had passed a law requiring the State Department to put the full name of Jerusalem, comma, Israel, on the passport of any citizen who was born in Jerusalem and who wanted the full name on it. And Presidents Bush and Obama refused for diplomatic reasons to do that. So it was plainly a Category 3 case, President defying the absolutely clear command of Congress. And you might expect, if they were following Justice Jackson's framework, that it would be upheld, that it would be struck down unless there's really clear indications to the contrary. The rest of the opinion do not claim that there's anything clear. In fact, the rest of the opinion indicates that there's really no clear text, there's no clear history, but lo and behold, the president won anyway. And so the Supreme Court says it's following this test, but when push came to shove, they did not.
Yeah, and I want to ask you this question of what are some of the weaknesses of approaching it this way, and what do you propose in your book? But even for myself, just going through the exercise in my mind to begin with, okay, so theoretically, if Congress could approve of anything, therefore the presidential action could also be considered constitutional, which I don't think might always be the case. But tell us a little bit more about the framework and how you would, and what you propose as an alternative.
Well, there are a number of problems with this, beginning with the fact that it's not easy to tell whether the president is acting in accordance with or in opposed to what Congress has done, because it's all a matter of interpreting the statutes. And so there have been a number of recent cases, and the Trump cases are going to be, up there pretty fast. But a number of recent cases under recent presidents where the president claims an authority to act based upon highly ambiguous language in an old statute. And, an example of this would be President Biden's student loan forgiveness program, or President Biden's imposition of an eviction moratorium for renters during COVID. And the thing is that you first have to figure out whether the statute authorized the action or not. And you do that as a matter of straightforward statutory construction. And by the end of that analysis, you've answered your question, and the three-part test is really just, really doesn't have anything, because the hard questions are all whether Congress has authorized something or not. But beyond that, beyond the difficulty in even knowing what the categories mean, the first category is usually okay if Congress has authorized presidential action. It's the essence of the executive power to carry out the acts of Congress, unless, of course, the statute itself is unconstitutional, as sometimes they are, and Justice Jackson's first category doesn't really seem to take that into consideration. So, a huge issue in modern constitutional law is the so-called non-delegation doctrine, where it's unconstitutional, according to the court, for the Congress to delegate vast swaths of discretionary power to the executive without what it calls intelligible principles to guide that discretion. Well, that would be a Category 1 case, but where the president's action loses. Category 3 is a really strange category because the Constitution does give the president a number of significant powers which he exercises by virtue of his office and which Congress can't touch. The clearest examples of this are the pardon power and the veto power, some of his commander-in-chief powers, the power to negotiate treaties. Now, the Senate doesn't have to ratify a treaty, but the president has unlimited authority to actually go over and negotiate the treaty. The Congress can't tell him not to. And these are called in law prerogative powers. Prerogative powers are powers vested in the executive by virtue of his constitutional position, and where Congress has no authority to regulate or countermand them. Category 3 ought to distinguish between prerogative powers and others, but it doesn't, and so that's the problem. In the Zivotofsky case that I mentioned, which may or may not have been rightly decided, but ultimately what the court said was that this is a matter of that what's on a passport is a matter of communication between the United States and foreign nations. That's what a passport does, and that is within the prerogative powers of the president. But the worst problem about it is the twilight zone in between, because that's where most of the cases turn out to fall, and there's no guidance whatsoever. And what Justice Jackson does say, I think, is exactly the wrong approach, because he says, he talks about they have to consider contemporary imponderables. Well, just as an aside, if they're imponderable, I'm not really clear on how the courts are supposed to ponder them or consider them. But he talks about deciding them according to the imperatives of events. That sounds like the judges are supposed to decide cases based upon their judgments about the particular events from which the conflicts arise. And that is exactly what they should not be doing, because that puts the courts in charge of making policy decisions, whereas they need to be deciding who has authority. What the court's job is to decide who has authority, not to decide what the right answer is. And if they decide that these separation of powers questions on the basis of the so-called imperatives of events, they're going to be setting a precedent in the context of one imperative of events, and then lo and behold, the next case is going to come along, and the imperatives of events may be different, but the precedent is going to be the same. It's really important for separation of powers cases to be decided consistently across presidencies and across issues. Just to give one, really clear example of this, in a case in 1979 involving President Carter, the court approved his unilateral abrogation of our mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. And, basically this is one of these political cases where liberals and supporters of President Carter, cheered, and conservatives, and Barry Goldwater was the leading plaintiff against this, and conservatives and Republicans tended to be hostile. Well, the next time this happened was when President Bush abrogated the ABM treaty with Russia, and of course the politics was exactly the opposite, but the answer was the same. Well, I don't know how the imperatives of events are supposed to play out when separation of powers questions, hit this way. I mean, and this is really clear with Trump now because there were a number of cases where the Supreme Court held, and I think usually correctly, not always, but usually correctly, that President Biden was acting without proper authority based upon statutes. And now, of course, it's President Trump who's stretching statutes beyond their actual plausible meaning. And yet everybody lots of people wanted to cut President Biden lots of slack. Oh, isn't it terrible that the courts are getting in the way of President Biden's policies? Well, what was terrible for Biden isn't suddenly celebrated for Trump, and that's just not the way separation of powers is supposed to work.
Yeah, and before we dive deep into more of the modern day explorations, I'm just curious, do you have any insight into why Justice Jackson made this assessment if it seems to have so many holes in it? Was it, a product of a particular political time? Was it a misunderstanding of the judicial role? I'm just curious if you have any background into that.
I really don't know, but not only did he think this was a good way to look at these questions, but subsequent courts have thought so as well. And the and if you look at the academic literature, this three-part test is accepted. There are only a few of us who have been criticizing it, and it doesn't seem to break on ideological lines. I tend to be right of center, and my friend Larry Tribe at Harvard is, very much, of the opposite political dimension, and he and I are probably the most outspoken critics of this three-part test. There may be a slight personal story. I don't know if I should bring this up because I really don't think the Supreme Court could usually operates this way. But it is true that the first time the U.S. Supreme Court majority embraced the three-part test was in Dames and Moore against Regan, a case written by William Rehnquist, at that time Associate Justice William Rehnquist. Well, he happened to be a law clerk to Robert Jackson in the year that the steel seizure case came down. And one wonders if maybe there's a personal connection there.
Because Rehnquist is one of the proponents of the three tiers strongly.
Yes, because he embraced his opinion that embraced this,
Mhm.
and it was written by his boss at a time he was working for Jackson. So I don't know. And then the test has been re-embraced in opinions by our current Chief Justice John Roberts. And can you guess who he clerked for?
No.
He
Really?
clerked for Rehnquist, and he did it in the year of Dames and Moore when the three-part test was first embraced. So I don't know if there's any causal connection here, but it sure is an interesting coincidence.
Yeah, absolutely. It's law is a very astute practice and we're all still humans. We can't escape that aspect of ourselves. So the sleuthing could be fun for somebody who wants to explore that in a potential in a potential study. But so in your book, you talk a lot about the framers' intentions of executive power and how they might have thought of it. What do you think they would be most shocked by looking at the current dynamics of the executive branch?
I actually think that's a pretty easy question. I have no doubt they would be shocked by the extent to which modern presidents act unilaterally without consulting Congress and without really seeming to care very much about what Congress says. They believed that Congress was going to be by far the most powerful of the branches. James Madison was so convinced of this that he worked to build extra checks on the power of Congress precisely because he worried that he said that Congress would draw all powers into its vortex. So he imagined a situation in which separation of powers would break down because Congress would dominate everything. well, that isn't the way it has worked out.
It's so interesting to consider it myself because I don't think I've ever had a moment in my American history education where I thought, oh, wow, Congress is really powerful and the president is limited in their power. Um,
Well, can I comment on that though? I mean,
yes.
it hasn't been an irresistible trend one direction.
No.
It does go up and down, and sometimes when a president oversteps, there has been a reaction. So I think the best example of that is President Richard Nixon, who had a very aggressive view of the powers of the presidency. Let's see, he prosecuted wars without authorization by Congress. He refused to spend money that Congress had appropriated. He gave personal commands to law enforcement in both IRS and Department of Justice to go after his enemies list. I don't know if any of this sounds familiar, but what did Congress do? First of all, he was almost impeached. The only reason he wasn't impeached and thrown out was because he resigned too fast for that to happen. But Congress then passed a series of structural reforms. I don't the reforms, whether you agree with them or not. I mean, that was certainly they were seen as reforms, cutbacks on presidential power. So the War Powers Resolution was designed to prevent presidents from taking us into wars like Vietnam. The Impoundment Control Act was designed to require that the president comply with the appropriations acts of Congress and not countermand them through executive assertions. There was some reorganization of the Department of Justice. Now, most of that wasn't actually statute, but there were a number of executive orders and regulations designed to protect the independence of law enforcement from direct commands. There was and the Emergencies Act, which subjected the president's ability to declare emergencies to legislative veto. And all of that left, I think it's fair to say that although President Nixon was aggressively asserting more executive power, he left the office in a diminished and weakened state. I think that might tend to happen when presidents overreach.
Yeah, and it's important to recognize, given my the personal experience I have is much more limited in terms of scope. But to see that over time, it hasn't just been, like you said, a march towards greater and greater executive power.
The people, the voters, have a lot to do with this too, because President Franklin Roosevelt also pushed the envelope in ways that were quite aggressive. He also got pushback from the courts. He also resisted this, but in so he was elected in 1932, and in 1934 his party won a resounding landslide and got both houses of Congress, and then he was reelected in a resounding landslide with both houses of Congress in his party's hands. And the result of that was to strengthen the presidency, whereas Nixon had to resign, and there was even a veto proof. The Democrats won in the election in 1974, and if my memory serves me correctly, they actually had a veto proof majority. So in effect, the people decide whether they like or dislike these moves. And so right now we don't know. I mean, President Trump certainly has his supporters, and I don't read a whole lot into short-term polling data, but I think it's a great thing about our constitutional system that in about a year and a half we're going to get to vote, and we'll find out what the people think.
Yeah, I'm curious how you think like the conversations that Hamilton and Madison were having debating executive power during like for the Articles of Confederation, particularly how that might help us understand or how it might assist us in thinking about rebalancing the system we have.
The historical context here is very confused because The Hamilton and Madison and other framers had been through an experience which has kind of looked both ways. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive.
Yeah.
It was a Congress only. There also was almost a no federal judiciary. And it just as an example of how poorly this worked, George Washington was appointed commander in chief, but the War Committee in the Congress under the Articles, which is chaired by John Adams, like they micromanage the war, and this is not a good idea. Don't try it at home. Running wars by committee doesn't work very well. And they, about a year later, actually less than a year later, Congress concluded that had been a mistake, and they actually vested power in the commander in chief and General Washington to make the important tactical and strategic decisions in the war. They had learned their lesson that you needed executive power, and at the Constitutional Convention, one of the very first things that they did was to establish an executive branch. Now, there were major debates over what powers the executive branch would have and how it would be chosen and so forth, but there was never any debate over whether there should be an independent executive. And so the immediate past that they were looking at, the problem was too weak or an absence of an executive. And when you look at the 13 states and their constitutions, their governors were extremely weak. Only 2 of them had a veto power. All but 2 of them were elected by the legislatures. Most of them did not have the power to make the major appointments. They were so weak, James Madison actually called them ciphers. And again, most constitutional reformers looked at that and said, no, we really need stronger executives as a check against willful legislatures. So there was a lot of tailwind and support of a much more powerful executive. Now that said, they had had very unhappy experiences with powerful executives in colonial times. Not just the king. All you have to do is read the Declaration of Independence, which has one attack on King George after another to see, they had some serious problems with the monarch. But their problems with the monarch paled in comparison to their problems with the colonial governors, who were very powerful, and they were extremely unpopular figures. And so these examples of willful, arbitrary rule by single-headed monarchs was pointing the other way. So I think that the formation of the executive branch was the most difficult single project that the framers in Philadelphia had to face, because there was no successful model. Looking at the history of the world as of that point, there had never been a republic of any serious extent. There have been some city-states, but no republics of any serious extent that had a Republican executive. So they just didn't know what they looked like. They had to make it up.
In your book, you talked about how the take care clause had been overlooked. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you reinterpret that in its role of limiting presidential power as one of the attempts to curb this knife's edge that the founders were trying to split?
Well, I don't want to I make no claims of originality here. What I think is that the take care clause has simply not been given as much attention as it should. And the history of the take care clause, I think, is quite clear about what they were looking for.
And maybe actually, real quick, for our listeners, what is the take care clause?
So the take care clause is a provision of Article 2, Section 3. And it provides that it says the president shall, take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Now, the very first drafts, predecessors to that, gave the president the power to execute the laws. Well, the take care clause imposes a duty to take care that they be faithfully executed, which I think is a very subtle but interesting way to put it, because it isn't a power. It isn't that the president can choose to execute the laws. It's that he has a duty to execute the laws. But it also, when it uses the passive voice in this interesting way, that he takes care that the laws be faithfully executed. Well, executed by whom? That suggests somebody other than himself, and thus is a gesture toward not just a president, but an executive branch, which would be under his ultimate control. And there's also a bit of realism here. Not every law is enforced 100% of the time. You just think of very ordinary laws like, say, speed limits. Uh, they're not enforced, thank goodness, they're not enforced all the time. There's a certain latitude for practicality and for the fact that enforcement resources are limited. What the president has an obligation to do is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, which means that in good faith, the president needs to be using the resources at his command to achieve the purposes of these laws. And this sets up a number of controversies over American history, but especially most recently, because it's really only been in the last several presidencies that presidents have openly announced that they were not going to enforce laws. I think President Obama's decision not to enforce the immigration laws in his so-called DAPA and DACA programs, Congress did not give the president discretion to say, well, here are some sympathetic cases where you don't have to enforce the laws. But that's what President Obama did. They actually, it wasn't like speed limits where, the police let some people by because they can't enforce it against. They actually gave people laminated photographic IDs that gave them permission to remain in the country when Congress had said that they couldn't. It's hard to imagine a more blatant decision not to faithfully execute the laws. Now, there may have been good humanitarian reasons for this and so forth, but President Obama had tried to work with Congress to get some of these exceptions. The Dreamers Act but Congress didn't pass these things. And when Congress debates something and then doesn't pass it, it is not a law. And the president does not have the right under our Constitution to say, well, the Congress isn't doing its job, so I'm going to, pick up the phone and the pen and do it myself. And since then, there have been, more and more examples, and President Trump is doing it yet again. So on practically his first day in office, he announced he was not going to enforce the statute that banned TikTok unless TikTok was sold to American owners. Now, whether you like the law or you don't, it was a law, and he just decided not to do it. He's announced, and I don't really know what has taken place since the announcement, but he's announced that they're not going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act because he thinks that it hampers the ability of American businesses to do business abroad, where I don't know. I don't do business abroad, but at least it is said that it isn't uncommon to expect to have to grease the wheels with a little with some low-level bribery, and but whether that's true or not, it's a law on the books, and the president does not have the authority to say we're just not going to enforce it because we don't agree with it. So these things are bipartisan. We have presidents of both parties asserting authority that they just don't have.
The imperial presidency isn't a new debate. but is something fundamentally shifting in the Trump 2.0 version, or is he inheriting a system and inheriting sort of everyone's familiarity with the executive branch stepping outside of its delegated zones?
Well, the idea of imperial presidency is not all that new. I think Schlesinger's book by that title was written over 50 years ago. You should check that out and edit that out if I made a mistake, but I think that that's right. Is Trump just repeating? It's slightly difficult because many of the things that Trump is doing are following precedents set by others, by Biden and Obama in particular. So what's different? One is that the sheer volume of unilateral executive activity has been so great. It's been so large. There's so much going on that it certainly feels like something different. It feels like this has gone beyond, just quantitative difference to maybe qualitative difference. That we're looking not just at the occasional assertion of authority that the president may not have to lots of assertions of authority. So that's one point. Another point is that President Trump has a different style of rhetoric. Past presidents, when they do sneaky things, can maybe do things in the quiet and like not call attention to them, but Trump just trumpets them. It's and in many cases he actually exaggerates what he's doing so as to make them look even more dramatic than they actually are. You take, for example, some of the Doge actions, and he says, well, Doge is cutting spending, cutting programs. Well, actually, Doge isn't cutting spending. What We could talk about what Doge is really doing, but Doge doesn't have the power to cut spending. Spending is still in the hands of Congress, and we don't yet have a clear example of where we have some possible close cases. Maybe the president has stepped over the line, but there's not a really clear example of where he's refusing to spend appropriated funds, and we won't really know until Congress passes its appropriations bills in this coming year whether whether the budget is really going to be cut or not. But so President Trump says these things that make him actually look like he's doing even more, and the rhetoric involved is often very, I know it's intentionally provocative, whereas past presidents, by and large, when they're doing controversial things, have tried to do them in a way that sound less provocative. And then a third thing that seems to be different is that President Trump seems to be sidelining or ignoring his lawyers. Now, we can't be sure because we don't know exactly, what's happening. There's all behind attorney-client privilege and so forth. But there are certainly news reports that some of the executive orders were not reviewed by the Office of Legal Counsel, which is the ordinary way of doing things. Office of Legal Counsel is the unit within the Department of Justice that is the official word on legal interpretation for the executive branch, subject, to be sure, to the supervision of the Attorney General and ultimately the President. But it's so, sometimes Office of Legal Counsel will just say you can't do this. It was proposed, for example, that President Obama, using a strange interpretation of Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, would be able to override the debt ceilings passed by Congress. And OLC said you can't do that. And the Secretary of the Treasury said, well, apparently we can't do that, so let's stop talking about it. We're just not going to do that. That's what usually happens. But it's also true that sometimes what OLC will say is that there's a lot of litigation risk, that this is going to be difficult to defend in court. It doesn't mean that there's necessarily no argument in its favor, but it's probably not going to go well. And then, as you say, OLC also can just flag what's going to lead to congressional opposition, to greater commotion. And the OLC it's a source of a lot of historical memory, and they know how things have been done, and it's true that, I mean, this is both President Trump's virtue and also his vice, is that he doesn't really care how things have been done before.
Mhm.
So I think many of the people who voted for Trump are delighted that he is breaking things. They think that things have not been going well, and it's time for a president to just, say, to hell with that. Let's do it this way. Um, but I'm much more in the sort of legalistic camp and think that lawyers' advice should be consulted, and I think a client should follow it unless and if they're not going to follow it, they at least should understand it and know what they're up against and have very good reasons to the contrary. But there is reporting that a number of these executive orders did not even go to OLC, and that they started. What I have read, and again, I don't know, I'm not on the inside, but the reporting is that even when they have been reviewed by OLC in more recent weeks, that OLC is given one shot and they can make some comments, and then that's kind of it. Whereas in the past, it was an iterative process. OLC would say, well, here's a problem with this, and the White House would say, well, how about this? Does this solve the problem? And the OLC would say, well, no, not. And it would go back and forth until, which is a typical way in which clients and lawyers operate. But I cannot believe that OLC approved the executive order about birthright citizenship. I cannot believe that OLC approved the executive orders retaliating against individual law firms by name. These are things that are so far outside the legal norms that I just don't think that. I think they must have just happened without approval. So that's another thing, is that it just seems as though the executive actions here are less guided by law. Now, I should say that, in the past, presidents do sometimes do things that their lawyers advise against. President Trump is not the first one to do that, but it seems as though this administration is less concerned about legal conflict with legal norms than ones before. And so I think that is a difference. And then there's a huge difference in appearance, because half the country may be more or less supportive of Mr. Trump, but most of the newspapers are not. Most of the law professors are not. Most of the people who comment, like the people who control the megaphones in our news world, are not. And so when Mr. Trump does things, he has very noisy opposition immediately to almost everything he does, whether what he does is lawful or not. Whereas with presidents like Biden or Obama, most of those same sources would cut them a little slack. You did not see, take the President Biden's student loan forgiveness. You didn't have a whole bunch of people saying, "Oh, this is a constitutional crisis. The president is spending $400 billion not authorized by Congress." It's just, a few Republicans were saying that, but it wasn't. Nobody was. This was not a groundswell. Whereas with Trump, everything he does creates a groundswell of opposition, and it may even be to his benefit, because at a certain point, when everything he does gets treated as a constitutional crisis, you just kind of wonder, well, you know, are we hearing the boy who cried wolf?
This idea of overreach and the constitutional crisis, and it's not just Trump. like Trump is perhaps a an outcome of a lot of other constitutional issues that have been going on for years in the States. What do you see as being some of the most impactful actions or key moments that could potentially restore balance to the branches of government?
Well, there are basically two possible scenarios. One is that President Trump puts the pedal to the floor and does provoke constitutional crises. Starts just plainly disobeying orders from the courts. He's come mighty close on a couple of occasions already, but he you know, there's usually some kind of a fig leaf so far, but that may end. So you could have more and more confrontation, and who knows what the result of that is going to be. On the other hand, it could be that he will strategically retreat when there's enough resistance. It looks as though at least some of the tariffs have been pulled back uh, as a result of this, and they have not there are a whole bunch of court orders out there, and they've only appealed a few of them, and there's no indication of any problem about obeying the rest. And so maybe there'll be tactical almost hesitate to say retreats in case President Trump is listening to this and he wouldn't like the word retreat, but let's just say uh, tactical adjustments. And some of President Trump's biggest supporters will say openly that one of the things about him that they like is that he does change, that he does not have such a fixed idea of things that he isn't able to reconsider, sometimes rather rapidly even. And so maybe he'll be doing that. He's going to have some victories in court because some of the things that he's been doing, I think, are lawful, and that the courts will say so. I think some of the things he's been doing will not fly in court. It's my hope. Being a former judge and a teacher of the law, and I'm kind of steeped in the idea of the rule of law is one of the most important principles in our government. So I hope I'm not too naive in this, but I kind of predict that the courts will strike down the worst of it, and they'll probably uphold the things that are not obviously illegal and where there's a reasonable basis for the action. And I think there are more of those than Trump's critics give him credit for. And so in the end, I think that's the most probable course forward is that he will be checked by the branch which is most independent, and then we'll just have to watch to see what happened in the elections. And who knows? But right now, it doesn't look that great for President Trump. But those things reverse, and the people are usually more concerned about actual consequences than they are about legal niceties. And in this respect, I think the tariffs have been the most important moves. And I remember Econ 101, and I took international trade economics when I was in college, and it's just very hard for the economist and me to think that these tariffs are not going to have the same result that high tariffs have had in the past, which is the opposite of what I think President Trump is intending. And that could be his biggest problem, because if the country slides into a recession as a result of crippling trade, uh, and if the many American manufacturing industries that depend upon inputs that are, component parts from abroad and materials from abroad, if they are uh, probably not put out of business, but let's say they're put at a serious disadvantage and have to cut back and reduce employment and so forth. I don't think the American people are going to have a lot of patience for that.
It's been really interesting to get both of a little bit of a look back perspective on the executive branch and reflect on some of the dynamics that got us here, as well as looking at the future. And for any of our listeners, I highly recommend you go check out The President Who Would Not Be King as a much more in-depth dive into understanding the executive branch, especially given our current political climate. So, Professor McConnell, thank you so much for joining us today on Madison's Notes.
Well, thank you, Laura.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes. If you're interested in more content like this, make sure to follow us on your favorite listening platform and find us on social medias under the James Madison Program. Madison's Notes is researched, hosted, produced, edited, and engineered by me, yours truly, Laura Laurent. And if you have comments or ideas for future guests or episodes, feel free to reach out to me through the James Madison Program social media. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week on Madison's Notes.